6:48 past the hour. Welcome back to Morning Joe. Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio said in a new piece for the New York Times that in private, Republicans admit they acquitted Trump out of fear. He wrote in part, "For the stay in office at all cost representatives and senators, fear is the motivator. They are afraid that Mr. Trump might give them a nickname like Low Energy Jeb or Lion Ted, or that he might tweet about their disloyalty, or worst of all, that he might come to their state and campaign against them in the Republican primary. In private, many of my colleagues agree that the president is reckless and unfit. They admit his lies, and they acknowledge what he did was wrong." And Senator Brown joins us now. So, I want to know the rest of sort of the equation here, because if they admit, and you've spoken to Republicans who admit they're doing this out of fear, don't they understand that they had the ability to stand up and perhaps put him in his place by standing up to him so that they wouldn't have to deal with him in the future?
Well, thanks, Mika, for the question. They have contributed to this Trump's strength with his base. I mean, if you're a voter in Kentucky, you have 2 Republican senators. You've had a conservative governor until this year. You have mostly Republican House members. You listen to Fox. You watch Fox. You listen to talk radio. You never hear any criticism of the president. So it builds on itself because these Republicans don't speak up. I don't think that they don't first of all acknowledge their fear. Most politicians think we all think we're more courageous probably than we are. So they don't acknowledge they're voting with them for fear, but I can see it. I go back 20 years to the Iraq War vote. I was in the House, and I remember the fear that people felt that George Bush would call them un-American or soft on terror. So I've seen that play out, and it usually leads to bad decisions. And I also acknowledge, as I did in the piece, that Republicans, they like the tax cuts. They like the attacks on labor rights and civil rights and the environment. They like the right-wing young judges that Trump's given them. So, but they fundamentally, they know better. Most of them know better. Most of them know that Trump lied. And I think the most telling part, perhaps, is that their presidential nominee from just 8 years ago, whose faith is really important to him, if you can see up close or from a distance with Mitt, that none of them followed him, their presidential nominee, much out of fear from their base. And they're seeing what their base is doing to Mitt Romney.
Well, I'll bring in Joe here, who I know wants to ask you a question. But Joe, this is, I mean, in the case of the senators voting for acquittal, this was an opportunity to get out of a really sick, messed up relationship. And, you know, they would have had another president, Pence, who could have done all the same bills and all the same things that they support without this sick, messed up, abusive relationship they were in, and they chose against it.
Well, Mike Pence, actually, who has shamed himself over the past 3 years, but before that, Mike Pence actually, and I'm sure Sherrod would agree, he's at least conservative. He's an ideological conservative. I believe in the past he's shown that he understands and respects constitutional boundaries. So I agree with that. But Sherrod, let's just step back. Let me be devil's advocate here. I obviously have been harshly critical of the Republican Party for following in lockstep with Donald Trump and for evangelical religious leaders for doing the same thing. But, you know, I've been around a while, too, like you, for 20 years or more. And I do remember during the Clinton impeachment, Democrats, whether it was in the House, Jim, or whether it was in the House dining room, you know, kind of saying, Clinton's a liar. You can't make a deal with him. He'll never keep his word. He's a dog. I know he's lying about, you know, this stuff during impeachment. And I even remember the so-called conscience of the Senate, Moynihan, saying, if the president's not telling the truth, I'm going to vote to impeach. Of course, he didn't do that. So what do you say to Americans who say, well, they're all alike? There's a reason why Mitt Romney was the only member of a president's party in the history of the Republic to vote to impeach a president.
Yeah, I don't say that. I mean, first of all, a number of us spoke out about what Bill Clinton did. It didn't threaten the republic and threaten democracy and undermine democracy. I mean, Trump's done things, as you've said on your show, Joe, and Mika said, and Willie said, and others that Richard Nixon never even did. So it wasn't the threat to the republic at that point. But a lot of us called him out. A lot of us said he should be censored. But yesterday, I wanted to flip to something else from what Willie said. Willie and you both said, Joe, earlier in the show, that to watch, it wasn't just the president's performance yesterday in in a place that he shouldn't talk like that, frankly, the White House, but it was the enabling senators and House members sitting there and continuing, even though some of them had said, well, the president's going to learn from this. He'll take a lesson from this. He won't do it again. And they're all enabling him as he does it again. So it's fear. It's more complicated, of course, than fear. And I pointed that out in my article. But so much of it's fear does the business too often in the United States Senate. And this was as poignant and as awful example of it as I've ever seen this past week.
And his cabinet, too. The Attorney General of the United States was sitting in that room as well. Senator, it's Willie. I do want to ask you about what we're seeing here in the Democratic primary. About a year or so ago, you dabbled with the idea of hopping in with your Dignity of Work campaign. You went to Iowa to take a look, ultimately decided not to run. What's your assessment, not just of the chaos in Iowa, but of the state of play right now, where Joe Biden in New Hampshire appears to be slipping, Mayor Pete Buttigieg rising, and Bernie Sanders holding his spot near the top of the polls?
Yeah, it's still early. It doesn't seem early to the candidates that have been doing this for 14 months, but voters are just starting to turn in. I mean, I talk to people at church on Sunday, on weekends when I'm home, on Mondays and Fridays before I fly back to Washington, and people are just starting to tune in. I mean, people barely, to most voters, they haven't really thought about this much. Ohio's primary is, of all days, on St. Patrick's Day, and that's right after, it's 2 weeks after Super Tuesday. We'll know more then, and I think the Democrats are understanding, too, that our primary season has to be a little bit more reflection of our party and more diverse, and just the competing forces and demographics that have made us a rich country and make the Democrats the party I'm proud to be in.
All right, Senator Sherrod Brown, thank you very much for being
Good
on
to
the
be
show.
with you.
Have a
Thank
great
you,
weekend.
Senator.
Thanks.